Hi, Tara. It's good to see
Hello.
you. And thanks so much for doing this. It's always lovely talking to you.
My pleasure. I'm very excited. Thanks for asking.
Tara, I have been thinking about how to actually introduce you, because you've been doing a little bit of everything from photography to design to working in museums. But what I really wanted to get into was your writing and your poetry. How did poetry start for you?
So the very first poem I remember writing was at school. There was one little bit of creative writing, but I once sat in a kind of free period in primary school, and I made a poem. I can't remember the name of, but it basically was A is for Andrew and Andrew is. And I did the entire class. I did one thing for everyone, and I put it on this big piece of paper, and it was just something really fun, and it got the whole class involved. And by the end, I had everyone sat around, and everyone wanted to see what their adjective would be and who they were, kind of, you know, from my perspective. And I loved that. I don't know what, I still have that piece of paper to this day. Actually, I wish I had it in this house, but it's in my mum's house. And that was kind of the first bit of poetry I remember writing. And then I don't think I wrote again for a while. Then I used to write poems about Doctor Who because I'm a massive nerd. But again, it was about learning. So I would constantly read books about space and wanted to interpret and kind of take this character's experience of the world, which was so different to me, and then bring it and then kind of imagine. It was a way of imagining what it was like on these different planets, or it was all kind of like, I guess, romantic-esque poetry, but set in another world or set about the kind of universe. So there was that. And then I fell out of it again for a really long time, until sixth form, where so we did it in school. Everyone kind of, you know, has an experience with poetry, and they make you analyze a word to the point you're like, it's literally just the color red, please leave me alone. And I'd gotten to that stage. And so I left sixth form, my attendance was very bad. I had a bit of a rocky start, and so I was kicked out of sixth form. And during that time, towards the end of the year that I had out, I fell in love with poetry, but my own version. Like I went reading. I worked in a Books for Free, which was a charity shop that gave out free books that were rescued from landfill, and I found a collection of Shelley's poems. And I opened it and I read Hymn to Intellectual Beauty, and I was like, this is the best thing I've ever seen in my life. Like, what is this? And I spent hours just reading this book and kind of just learning about the romantics, and I fell so in love with it. And so then I started writing my own in that kind of style, and then I just didn't really stop. So yeah, I think it was all about, and the poems that I used to write early on were taking the world around me and kind of pushing it inwards and trying to describe what I saw phenomenologically, I suppose. This kind of how do I feel about the things around me, or how do I understand and interpret, and what's my experience of that color blue, or how does the fact that my best friend's eyes match the color of the trees outside make me feel? Like, what are those connections? And yeah, so I think that was my early foray into poetry, and then it just kind of continued.
There is a fantastic element of interaction in what you're telling as well. Also with that first little poem you did where you involved everyone, literally.
Yeah.
You make it social from the very beginning.
Yeah.
I absolutely love that. I was thinking, Tara, because I mean, poetry is an interesting form of storytelling. And also it is one of the very early forms, and it kind of has its own special place in literature as well. But I was wondering, from your perspective and with your experience in it, what can poetry do that perhaps other forms of storytelling can't do in the same way?
I think so. I've been kind of thinking about this for a while. There's something so archaic about it. I think we're beings of rhythm. Like, I think humans are naturally rhythmic. Our hearts beat. There's a reason Shakespeare's so successful, and I'll argue it's not in his word choice. It's in the fact that his lines are written in iambic pentameter. It mirrors us, like, and even within his work, if something's offbeat, you can say those lines to someone and they will kind of know that something's off just because a word doesn't quite fall in the right rhythm. And they don't need to have a literature degree or to even understand the words that Shakespeare's saying. You understand the rhythm, and poetry has that. I think I like short form poetry, but I'm a rhythm person in poetry completely. I also think that rhythm is how we remember things as well, and that's part of the memory.
Yeah.
And the memories are, I think it's in that rhythm, it carries memory. And somehow that, even if you don't understand the language or understand what's exactly being said, you can get a sense of it just from where the beats fall or just from the sound, even vowels, using the emphasis on, something that's got a lot of O sounds in it, a sentence that would have a lot of O's, will give you a kind of sense of longing, or you'll be able to sense it within it. If you've got a lot of short A's, you understand that it's very snappy, it's going fast, and those what's transmuted to the person on the other side of the person saying that sentence or saying that piece of poetry, it doesn't necessarily, it's not within the words, the emotion that those sounds cause or that rhythm creates will be basically sent over, and they'll understand that at least, which is why sometimes I think you can even go into, I once went to Spain, and in Seville I met me and my boyfriend were stood on a rooftop with a man who didn't speak a word of English and we didn't speak a word of Spanish, and somehow we were there for about 4 hours having a chat with this guy, and most of it, I'd argue, is that we were understanding from the intonation, from the tone, from the rhythm, from the gestures. And so it's like, how much of language is actually carried in the words? Is it not in the sounds or in the way that we kind of embody it? And I think poetry does that, and I think it's been doing that for much longer than, arguably words didn't really come into being, well, they did come into being, but the earliest forms of them was just sounds, gurgling at each other, and the kind of patterns to that. And I don't know, I think there's something so archaic that maybe we don't even quite understand because we've lost it, because it's been around for so long, but we've been doing it for donkey's years essentially, and I think there's something so powerful about it. I'm in love with it.
I love that. It is such a brilliant observation, and I think you're right, because especially when you mention you don't necessarily have to understand it. There is an understanding in the flow. I remember, I just got to think when you were talking about foreign languages, when I had English in school, and there was a point when we started reading Shakespeare for the first time in English, up until then it had been Danish translations, and you get a lot of words that are now not part of the English language, and you're sitting there with your dictionary and you look them up, words like counterfeits, and they all sound grand and fantastic, and I didn't know them, they were not part of the English I had learned so far, but I remember often wanting to learn how to pronounce them before I even cared about understanding them. It was like meaning was not important. I kind of knew the plot of what we were reading anyway, but the exact meaning was not that important. I just wanted to get the flow. And you can do that with, well, I'm a massive Shakespeare fan, but you can do that with Shakespeare especially, and others as well, where you can almost sense how you should read something out loud. If this should be, am I angry, or am I shouting this, or am I being very gentle and subtle? Or you can sense that almost from the rhythm and from the flow. And I love that. That's a fantastic observation. That
I think that's why, as you say, like, I'm a photographer, I also make videos, I also work with sounds sometimes, I work in spoken word, I write in plays, and it's all of it is the rhythm. That's what it's all finding the either the visual rhythm, it's amazing. And you're
already going into my next question, because I wanted to ask you about the musicality that is in poetry, because there's a reason why I think we have often put music to poems, but also that poems can essentially stand on their own. There is a great sense of musicality in that. And I was wondering, in your work, Tara, what does that do anything to the language, to the poem itself, or to the story perhaps?
Yeah, I think it does a huge amount. So I I always I'm not very good with music. I can't play an instrument. I can't read notes. I have no idea about anything to do with music. But I was recently working with Charlie and Jake, who are these two amazing people from Bristol who do kind of improvised soundscapes to poetry. And I said, oh my God, what you do is amazing. You know, it's so musical. I've got no talent in that. Like, that's beyond me. And they just went, what do you mean your work's so musical? And I was like, what is it? And that made me start thinking about it. And actually, I think my inability to create music outside of myself has meant that I attempt constantly to embody that rhythm somewhere or change it. But I think that for me in my work, musicality is so important, because I think it helps bridge it helps bridge so much. Like as you're saying, with certain words, like my mum often will say a word and she'll say it in a sentence, and then she'll go, is that the right word?
Yeah.
And it'll take me a second, and I'll go, yes, it is the right word, but the reason she said it is because it sounds so natural at the end of what you're saying. It just fitted in. And then thinking about the reason for that, the fact that people who don't have certain levels of academic kind of achievement, or people that, you know, don't speak a certain language or understand these things, musicality kind of smooths all that over, because it's something that I think we all understand or can take pleasure in, or can kind of and it adds layers into it as well. I think rap music and hip hop are two of my biggest inspirations. Like, I love them. I think they need to be studied way more and counted as actual poetry, because they're out there doing mad stuff, and that is amazing to me, because the musicality within, just so if you take away actually the music that goes alongside it, the musicality of the lyrics, the fact that you know, you've got those beat changes and it's so hard, like those internal rhyme schemes are incredible, and they're mostly using the sounds of vowels to hang things on, and it actually makes me so excited. But what I find with that is the musicality is the first layer that goes in, right? That's the first thing I hear, is like, oh, it's got rhythm to it. Yeah. But almost hidden below that, you can spend so much more time, because you kind of enjoy the first layer, and then you move into the second layer. It's like, okay, what are these words actually saying? What's the images, like the imagery that's encoded beneath it? And then from the images, you start to realize that, hold on, these sounds, like there's wordplay here, the entendres, you know, by using sound and just changing something slightly, you've changed one word into another word, and then that changes the whole image. And so there's so much to unlock. And yet I find, because of the musicality, I tend to get lost in it, and it's taken me years with some songs to actually decode them and spend that time with them. But it means that I kind of have this such a long, loving relationship, because they didn't give me all their secrets at once. The musicality kind of helps with it. It means that I get to spend a lot of time just enjoying it, but then also playing with it. And I think it's playful and it's exciting. And yeah, and like musicality invites anyone to kind of come and enjoy it. It doesn't put people off, I think.
Well, that's true.
You know,
I think universal, and we can connect. Everyone can connect to music.
Yeah.
And I think, I do think it requires what you're doing. I think it requires a lot of musicality, actually, writing poetry, because it does require you have a sense for that flow.
Yeah.
As you created, you know. But that's a really, really good observation. And I love that rap music as well, because it's a new form, but it's a very distinct form of music. It's not really anything we've seen before when rap music sort of started to emerge.
And I have an argument. I think that Edgar Allan Poe would love rap music, and I think this often. I've been reading about it. If you read The Philosophy of Composition by Edgar Allan Poe, a lot of the stuff that he writes in it about taking the form forward, that's a lot of what poetry, like,
that's a good point. Yeah.
There's just so many people who were and are in the kind of late 1800s, early 1900s, mid 1800s, who are playing with rhythm, like in that very kind of well tightened, well oiled way. And they're not hugely popular at the time. They tend to become so afterwards. But I think that this is, it very much excites me. But
you're so right. You're so right. Oh, it's really fascinating. I'm switching it a little bit now, Tara, because I also wanted to get with your photography background in mind, is there a how to put it, a visualization or a picture aspect to poetry as well? Or is that something you've had a look at or incorporated somehow?
So my very first piece of independent kind of artwork, I did what's called the extended project, which is an A-level that you can opt into doing alongside your other A-levels. And the thing that I created was a poetry and photography anthology, and I launched it, and it was my poems, but then also other poems, and then photography that went alongside it. I actually still think I have the link for the online diary that I made alongside it, so I'll send you that if you fancy.
I'll put it in the link below, along with
my
your website as well. So have a look below for Tara's website.
Or up there, wherever I am, that way, somewhere. So I created that, and I launched it, and I remember kind of going through these poems and thinking, what were the images that I was seeing? And the classic one is two roads diverged in a wood, by Robert Frost. And the classic one would be to have two roads diverging in a wood, or a woody forest scene. And I think that there's a lot of images on the surface of poems, but there's always tends to be a second image. And so the whole thing was called double think, or double exposure. And it was the fact that actually most poems are double exposures. They have the first thing that you see in the visuals that are given to you, and then the moral, philosophical, or the deeper meanings, or in the terms of Robert Frost's poem, the fact that it seems like he's saying one thing and then he's saying the opposite, that these two roads, where do I go? It doesn't fucking matter in the end. You end up exactly where you're going to go. And so my thing was that I had these two train tracks that I'd taken a picture of at Kentish Town, and they were the two train tracks coming into one, and just as the sunlight was hitting them, it was rebounding off. It looked really nice. And so I tried constantly to find that, what's the double edge in most poems that you find, or what's the hidden image alongside the main image. So I think that they're very interlinked, and that poetry and photography are kind of two sides of a similar coin. They're doing the same thing, as I was saying at the beginning. It's all about how we see the world, and both of them are attempting it, but in two different ways. It just so happens that I know how to, or have an affinity for trying both of them. But I think people who are artists, who are poets, who are photographers, are all trying to do the same thing, or expressing the same thing, or have the same thing within them, that they're looking out in the world and going, how can I capture this? How do I get this moment? Yeah.
I like also, Tara, that you're saying is you're describing it as something that's linked essentially, and not something that's a layer or an add-on. Because I don't really think it can be, because if it is, it might be nice, but it's not really connecting, is it? But that goes for both the musicality and the flow of a poem, but also very much the visualization, or the picture, or the sort of picture language that follow a poem. But it is interesting. I wanted to ask you about this as well, about how you can experiment with poetry as both a language form and a storytelling form. And I was wondering if you've any thoughts about where are we going with this in the future? Where are we experimenting with poetry in the future? We talked a bit about rap there, but what are we going to do? What's going to happen with it?
I don't know. I think the thing that stood in my head from kind of the last question, or what we were discussing, is I think everyone's within a stream, or like the stream of life, and they are just trying to capture moments endlessly. We're all just trying to harness, capture, or keep something that is a memory, or is an experience, is a smell, is a sound, is something you can throw on the Instagram, or throw on Instagram, or we're all, everyone's now photography. You've got your phone in your pocket. Everyone's a poet, in my argument, because we're constantly having Zoom meetings and spoke. So long as you talk, you're a poet, in my opinion, because that's using your voice. And so I think that all of those streams are going to start coming together again. I know that Caleb Femi just did an amazing debut piece, which has gone out of my head. I think, it's just called Paul. And in that, he's got photos. And so that's kind of merging those two things. And I think you're starting to see a lot more poetry, photography coming together. I know when I did that extended project, I could barely find any. I think I found a couple by Ted Hughes where he was doing some remains of Elmet, but there weren't that many. But now it's much easier to find kind of poetry that's going alongside artwork, poetry that's being kind of living off the page and also in it. It's being used in adverts constantly, much to the disdain of everyone else, because Halifax, stop using poetry in your adverts. It's so annoying. I don't even know if it was Halifax, because I refuse to know which of you banks were doing it, but stop it. It's, you know, it's just so annoying. Anyway, that's a whole other
I saw that one, actually. I can't remember which one it was.
Bloody anyway. So, but you know, it's starting to, one, be used as a commodity to sell things. I know Facebook and Instagram recently commissioned some poets to do different things, but there's also an amazing it's so incredibly linked to activism and to, you know, putting a voice to voiceless people, or to claiming back words or your way of doing and experiencing the world. So I think that by combining it, I don't know, I think it's going to start going somewhere that's more off the page as well, and I hope to see it more in museums, and to see heritage sites kind of using that as an
you read my next question. I actually think, because what I love about what you just said is that that thing about capturing a moment, because I think in many ways that's also what museums, especially in exhibitions, but generally in interpretation, also live interpretation and reenactment and so on, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to open a door into the past, essentially showing a tiny little picture of something that we know a little bit about. Yeah. And I wanted to ask you, as a museum professional as well, and you have so much work experience in museums and talk to audiences and visitors from all over the world, is there a place for poetry in museums? And if so, how?
So, sorry, I'm getting very excited about this question. I came into museums through a creative writing degree because I was like, wow, they actually tell stories off the page, and look at all these things, you can get so many people involved in them. That's my impression of me. So, so I think that going to the very first story of what I said, you know, the first time I did poetry, that all the children kind of crowding around, is so liberating for people who are writing it. It's so interesting and captivating for anyone viewing it, because you tend to kind of emote and feel the empathy for that person. It's also participatory. So many people can get involved in it, and there's so many different experimental kinds of poetry. You know, one person writes a line, and then the next person writes a line, and then the next one, and then eventually you've got a poem.
Social, isn't it? It's really social.
Yeah. And there's so many, that one of the things that I came into museums for, which I found the thing that actually attracted me to working in them, was that there are so many voices, one within museums and also excluded from museums. And if we're trying to capture a moment, you said, you know, you an exhibition is trying to put on, you know, you take a kind of frame and you go, this is it. How do you, without overwhelming an audience, change that frame, or allow them different layers, or allow them a different interpretation? And I think one of a powerful way of doing that is, if you've just got one viewpoint, it doesn't really work. But if you've got multiple viewpoints coming in multiple different senses, for example, I think people get a lot of museum fatigue just staring at things. My argument is, if you put more things in that was either to be touched or to listen to, it breaks down kind of the pressure put upon certain senses. So I went to the Welcome Collection recently, had an exhibition called Being Human, and they had one room.
I've just been there. Yeah, it's fantastic.
And they've got the room in the back that's got the poem. I can't remember I think his name was Stephen King. He had a poem being read in there, and it was really interesting how empty it was. But as soon as the poem started, how many more people were drawn in there from the sound, and then stayed. It wasn't a short poem, like they stayed for a while. And then once they'd listened to that, they went and looked at more things. And I can bet that probably, one, gave them a personal connection, because you're hearing voice, so when you're meeting that person in a way. I used to get really sad when I was a kid that I'd never know what Edgar Allan Poe sounded like, and I still find that sad. But you know, then there's something about that. The voice of a person is important, capturing what they sound like, the way the words sit in their mouth. All of those things are important, and you could get that through spoken word or through having diary articles are important artifacts. But I'd argue that if you're doing contemporary collecting or even commissioning, getting locals to, if there's a local exhibition going on, to write either about what you've got going on or about just about their experience, you could capture so much of it. Because I think not having the freedom of kind of not needing to make total sense on paper is liberating, and people kind of get a bit more of their emotions.
There is also something about making something come alive when you are, especially in a museum setting, because at the end of the day, we are displaying objects. They are static, they are dead. They might be exciting, but they're not really alive. But when you hear someone, even if it's just that, I think we all have our favorite actor reading an audiobook or something. There is something in a voice that just makes that connection so much stronger, even if it's not their own words they're reading, even if you're listening to Stephen Fry reading Harry Potter or whatever, there is something in that, in that personal connection that immediately triggers a sense of, well, I guess again, a social sense or a sense of interaction or an emotional atmosphere between people. There's this between people there. That's very powerful. I wish museums would actually explore that more. I think there's sometimes with hard to reach groups or groups that aren't traditionally feeling welcome in museums, that giving a space a voice, and by doing that, it gives a message of your opinions are welcome here, your voice is welcome here. It's not static or silent or oppressive or rejective towards people who might not be comfortable being quiet. They might be neurodivergent, or they might have a different experience of the world, and the museum can be triggering. It can be such a triggering environment, and so to have something that gives it a voice or gives it a personal kind of interaction is important. I found that sometimes with working with some visitors, it's if I interact with them, their feelings of negativity towards the space, they don't get directed at me. It becomes a kind of conduit to be like, oh, okay, like I can have a conversation about this, I can express the way I feel about this, and in a dialogue, and they just feel listened to and valued. And on the other side of that is that it can be incredibly important. I think museums should be involved in being local, and also be involved in the present, like as much as they are in the past, and making sure that people who are in a local area or who are part of that museum story, what it's trying to tell, are well and good and happy and supported, and doing that through poetry and workshops and outreach, dementia friendly type music evenings, but doing that with poetry or sounds, or there's so much potential for it. It's such a caring and explorative thing, and the musicality of it, the speech, the connection, has so many benefits for so many people. It's so true, so true. And you're touching on something there that I've been going on about for a long time, which is that sort of living in the past constantly kind of thing. Just because you're interpreting the past doesn't mean you have to live in it. You're interpreting it for the present, and sometimes for the future as well. And that's so true. And capturing those moments, and also capturing those moments together, because as you said, when you allow visitors to add their voice or contribute, more like it, with their voice, it doesn't become just an add-on. It doesn't become something you can just do because that would be fun. It becomes an experience that I'm part of creating because my voice has a place here. And that's just so important as well in that. And I think poetry is brilliant for that as well. It's perfect for that as well in so many ways. Anyway, sorry, Tara, towards the end, I was wondering, could we hear one of your poems? Would that be okay?
Yeah, it would be. So I found one that I haven't recorded before. So I thought you'd.
Oh, wonderful! This is a first.
I wrote this in lockdown. I was sitting on a bench in Tufnell Park, It was freezing cold, like the middle of December. And I was just thinking, I don't know, I had this welling up of kind of emotion about the city and about history. And so, yes, I ended up writing this.
That was probably also the worst part of lockdown, wasn't it? It was really, everything was shut. We were, yeah.
And I think that was part of it, you know, looking at these streets that normally are so teeming with life. I'm realizing they weren't, they were the same streets, but they weren't the same streets, and that the people and the atmosphere are just as much a part of the landscape as the landscape itself.
Yes. True. So true. So
true.
Go for it.
The city streets, they sing to me, whispering back Odyssey songs of lives lived long before mine, and of my own now intertwined. She sings, and I watch smoky spectres of my life reenact all that I've played out between the glass and the brickwork, all that I've written between the tube lines, all I've weaved while wandering, weak or weary, wondrous or cheering. A quarter of a century of pouring my secrets into the Thames, and all I wish for is another quarter and another after that. Time to spend watching the washing up remnants of Londoners 1,000 years long dead, and watching spectres in Georgian hats outside while I wait in Bossman's chicken shop, seeing phantom druids looking out from Hampstead on an evening stroll, hearing whispers on the tube lines as it thunders past the resting dead. How many years I could spend on Westminster Bridge, wondering if all those before me feel the love that swells up like the tide that's just come in, washing up on them back through time, because to me, a Londoner is never really alone, for our city and her history are our constant companions.
Oh, wonderful. Oh, wonderful, Tara. Well done. Thank you so much. Oh, that was quite emotional, that. Also because I'm in Hampstead, so I'm close. That's wonderful. But again, it's capturing that mood and the area right here and right now, where I am right now in this place as it is right now. It's fantastic. That was truly wonderful. Well done.
Thank you.
Tara, thank you so much.
It's all right, it's my pleasure. Thanks for such interesting questions. It's nice to talk about poetry.
So wonderful talking to you. We must do this again. Definitely. We could continue for a long time.
Hours.
Thanks so much, Tara.